Good morning, everybody. This is Anna Jenkins, Marketing Coordinator at Core BTS, and welcome to today's webinar, Ask the Incident Handler, What Should I Do During a Cyber Attack? Throughout our presentation this morning, we encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments using the Q&A pane in the WebEx Event Center. We'll be answering questions live both during the event and after our presentation today. We're also recording today's session, and we'll send a link to the recording after the event via email. Today on our panel, we have Robert Mertz, Principal Consultant and Incident Handler for Core BTS, Dan Eister, Core BTS Consulting Data Center Engineer, and Matt Wilson, Managing Consultant for our Security Services Practice. And at this time, I will pass it along to Robert to get us started.
Good afternoon. As was the intro said, my name is Robert Mertz, and I am with the Core BTS Security Practice. Who am I? I'm based out of the Mid-Atlantic region for Core BTS, and my primary focus is consulting is on strategic consulting, regulatory compliance, and technical testing.
Robert, are you there? I think we lost your audio connection. Hold tight, everybody.
I apologize. For that. We're having some technical difficulties here on the audio side, but I will continue here. We did the introduction, apologize, and we're proceeding with the next slide, which is the overview. So for today's discussion, we're going to go and we're going to define incident response. We're going to talk about PowerShell and is it actually useful for incident response, how to prepare for an incident, how to respond to an incident, and any recommended action plans. Goal setting. After today's conversation, you'll have a better understanding of the benefits of PowerShell while you're responding to an incident. What is PowerShell? For those of you who are involved in Microsoft, you might know this gentleman. His name is Ed Wilson. He's also known as the scripting guy. Ed Wilson goes and describes PowerShell as an interactive, object-oriented command environment with scripting language features. The programs that are executed are called commandlets, and they're used to simplify administration and configuration. Throughout this presentation, you'll notice I have several references where I got this information from, or for additional information if after the presentation you want to go and look up the white papers or the blog references for a more in-depth understanding. Windows artifacts. Whenever a computer interfaces with another system, it will leave traces of that interaction. Those traces can be found in the registry, they can be found on the system, they can be found on files and folders that have been placed onto the system. Now, with those Windows artifacts, they can be identified using built-in tools, for example, regedit, also a low-level registry editor. You can also use PowerShell commandlets, which is what we're going to be discussing here. You can use WMI queries, which are Windows Management Instrumentation queries, and then you also have .NET classes. Now, the PowerShell commandlets are actually built using .NET objects and also provide access to WMI. You might be thinking to yourself, if you're someone who's a CEO or other C-level executive, why would I really be concerned about this presentation if we're focusing almost exclusively on PowerShell and other tools that system admins might be using? Well, the answer is PowerShell is free. It's natively built into most modern Windows OSs. This directly affects your profit and loss as far as what your profit center is for your organization. If you're able to leverage and maximize tools that you already have at your disposal, it frees you up for other endeavors for your capital. PowerShell affords IT departments an economical first response capability Also, PowerShell is integrated into all of Microsoft's product offerings, whether it be Exchange, SharePoint, or administering Active Directory. So what is DIFR? DIFR is an acronym. It's often popularized by an organization called SANS. It stands for Digital Forensics and Incident Response. Let's define the problem. What does incident response mean for your organization? You know, incident response can mean many things to many people, and oftentimes digital forensics and incident response are used interchangeably, which causes even more confusion. Does it matter what I call it, whether it be digital forensics or incident response? Well, the short answer is yes, it does. With incident response, you're responding to any sort of incident, whether it be security or not. It could be user-related, it could be not. That's affecting performance of the organization. And your goal is you're returning the organization to normal business operations as soon as possible. Legal action is not the end goal here. You have more of a fix-it ASAP mentality. Another name for this would be live response. Digital forensics, on the other hand, your goal is there's already been an incident. Your incident response team has acted, and the incident response team, after analyzing what is occurring, has consulted with management and the incident response team lead, and they have determined that they have to go and take a digital image or forensic image. That image would include the system memory. That image would also include the hard drive. From those images that are forensically sound, they would then be passed by the incident response team to a digital forensic analyst. Now, a digital forensic analyst is going to perform an investigation for the sole purpose of collecting evidence for potential legal proceedings. An example might include theft of intellectual property, human resources violations such as sexual harassment allegations or a case using corporate assets like email or link-based chat, downloading child pornography. Unfortunately, this is something that you often read about in the news where someone will go and download some really inappropriate pictures of children or minors, and then the Attorney General for that particular state will go and basically do network forensics where they go and they get the source and destination IP of the host that is interacting with these pictures and inappropriate material, and then they'll go and execute a search warrant. Data breach by hackers, the thing that's on everybody's mind right now is OPM and the failings that occurred there which led to the breach of information. And any place where a computer system or a device was used or was the target of a crime. Now, when we talk about incident response, we're going to go through some specific examples in this discussion. So that's why they're left off this slide. Incident response. Let's go through the steps of what incident response is. So, as was mentioned, incident response, you are the first person or your team is the first team to be notified of a situation impacting the organization. The panic button is hit. Houston, we have a problem. Is this a potential security incident or is it not? So you first have to investigate to determine what the cause of the issue is. If it's a malware situation where something is causing an outbreak throughout the enterprise, you would want to go and isolate those affected systems. Now, you could do that physically by disconnecting the network connection, or you could do it logically by going and placing those affected systems into a separate VLAN and not allow routing out of that VLAN, so that way they're logically isolated. Or you could do logically isolating through firewall connections. An optional, as we had just mentioned in the previous slide, is to take an approved image of both the system and the system memory. When this occurs, the reason I say this is an optional step is if you know as an organization your goal is not going to be going to pursue some sort of legal case against the perpetrators, then you can just simply move to the next step, which is after you isolate the systems, you remediate the affected systems, you perform network forensics to identify any additional malicious traffic, and then you reintroduce the affected systems back to normal operation and connectivity. But you continue to perform network traffic analysis because you want to see if there's anything on your environment that has the signatures of the problem that was causing the outbreak, but just hasn't been active yet, so you haven't identified it. So if you're looking for command and control traffic, you're looking for something that is calling home, you need to know what that is so that you're able to go and say, okay, we've cleaned up this one host, but there's 17 other hosts on my network that are communicating back to the same beaconing source, or the place where evil resides. And as such, we need to go and track down those 17 hosts and clean them up as well. So digital forensics, here, the incident has been determined, it's been identified, and we know that we're going to seek legal action. Well, now you have to go, and instead of simply going through the steps of remediation, which if that falls in the realm of incident response, now you have to start a chain of custody. You want to isolate the affected systems, you want to image the affected systems, and again, you'd want to take both an image of the memory, the physical memory, as well as an image of the hard drive itself. You want to examine the collected images and the disks. All while doing that is you're creating a timeline of what occurred, when occurred, how it occurred, and who occurred. And then you're going to document all these findings and present it to the legal department or to law enforcement for action taken against the perpetrator. Now, the remaining of this presentation, we're going to actually focus on incident response. So you might be asking yourself, okay, we went through, can you explain to me what we need to do before an incident occurs? Something you want to keep in mind is 90% of incident response is actually going and preparing for the incident before the incident occurs. At a bare minimum, things that you have to have in place before an incident occurs, you want to create an incident response plan. Now this plan should be detailed. It should say, these individuals are part of an incident response team. They have a defined role. These individuals have defined responsibilities that they will take charge of during an incident. You also want to have a clear chain of command. You want to go and know who's going to handle what portions of the incident, such as legal. You want to have public relations if that's a requirement. You want to have somebody who's prepared to handle if there's regulatory issues that need to be, regulatory agencies that you need to interact with. And you want to go, and we include here, you want to create an incident response kit. So in that kit, you'd want to have the tools that you know how to use, that you've practiced using, that you're familiar with using, and you want to have done dry runs on using those tools. Now, additionally, you want to collect network analytics through various tools. This is where we're starting to get into the process of baselining. The network analytics, you can use free tools, or you can use proprietary tools on the commercial side. Wireshark, Snort, examples of free tools. You can use Bluecoat's security analytics platform, or you can use the Cisco SourceFire with FireAmp. The idea is you're looking for a baseline of the network traffic so that when it starts to deviate from that baseline, you know it'll aid you to try and find the source of that deviation and how to remediate it. You want to also go and create hashes of your key system files. So for example, if you have a server, an Exchange server, or you have a server that is a repository, a file share that has a lot of really proprietary information or information that you need to safeguard, that is a very prime target for a hacker or a perpetrator. If they can get some sort of malware on that system and then start exfiltrating that information off of the servers into their organization, that is a huge problem. Well, one of the ways you could prevent that from occurring is you could go and you could calculate a hash of the key files on that system. And then if those hashes are deviated or modified in some way because the file was modified, that's a clear indicator that there's something wrong. Then you want to also go and leverage tools and organizations such as SANS.org. They provide snapshot tools in the form of PowerShell scripts that we're going to go through during this presentation that will aid in this. To further elaborate on hashing of key system files for future comparison, this can be done natively in PowerShell using the getFileHash command. This commandlet, when you then point it to a particular file, in this case we're looking at the NT kernel within the Windows operating system, and we generate a SHA-256 hash. This is a manual process, so anytime that you go and install patches or you would install updates, you would have to, anything that would trigger a modification of that particular file, you would have to go and recalculate the hash. Now, there are alternatives which are automated. They would include Tripwire, McAfee is another solution, and there's others on the market. But in this, what they do is they actually go and calculate the hashes for you, and in some cases, depending on how you have your settings set within these products, if something goes to modify a file which has not been approved, such as a software update or a malicious piece of software, such as a rat Trojan or something, it will prevent the modification of that file because the hash won't match. This is the PowerShell commandlet which I had discussed. SANS is a fantastic organization. You can get a lot of information from them. Here, under the reference link, I provide a link to a download for baselining tools for Windows operating systems. This screenshot here is a table of contents screenshot when you run a system baseline snapshot.ps1 commandlet against your, snapshot.ps1 script against the system. What this will generate is it will generate output about the BIOS, it will generate about the users, the groups, who are the group members, passwords, hidden files and folders. It'll all produce this into various spreadsheets as well as text files. Now, where this is really helpful is if you have a system and you go and you generate this information in the form of a baseline snapshot, and then something happens and that you're called to investigate that system, and you go and run this snapshot commandlet again. When you do that, if you go and you see, for example, that all of a sudden there's some hidden files and folders that weren't out there before, or you see that there's a new account in the local admin account, the administrators group that wasn't there before, this really gives you a good place to start to figure out if that system is compromised or if somebody made an administrative change that wasn't documented and shared with the rest of your team. So you might be asking yourself, if the focus of this discussion is about PowerShell, why do I care about network baselines and network analytics? As we had mentioned in the earlier slides, the network baselines give you a sense of what normal traffic looks like. Anytime evil is introduced into a network and the evil starts to talk outside to the source of that evil, whether it be a server in China, a server in Russia, or something domestically here in the US, there's going to be a change in the traffic patterns of your network. And this is where if you have a very good network analytics tool in place, you're able to see what is leaving your organization, whether it be simple command and control traffic or something much more diabolical where they're actually exfiltrating company secrets or personnel files, as was the case of the OPM attack, out of the organization and to the other organization. So when responding to a system issue, you want to use PowerShell or whatever other tools your organization has determined to go and isolate and detect what the problem is on that host, whether it's command and control, what ports are being used, what protocols are being used. You're basically trying to develop a signature or a pattern of behavior for that particular issue, okay? Once you have that established, you then can take that information and use network forensics to identify the traffic in your network, both internal and external, to see who is communicating via those ports and protocols, who is communicating back to that source, who is communicating back to that control server for that piece of malware. And by doing that, you're able to go and identify, maybe you just have one, you think you have one particular server or one particular host that is compromised, but by doing network forensics and network analytics, you're actually able to determine that that's not the case. You actually have 17 servers or 17 hosts that are affected because they're communicating to the same source. It's just, for whatever reason, that particular host that you're working on, that piece of malware or that infection has gone active versus the other servers are still dormant. Something else to keep in mind is, in that example that we just went through, By doing network forensics, you're able to determine the scale of the problem much quicker than by individual hosts. Because if you have one host, you then have to wait for the other host to go active to try and fix them individually. Versus by doing network forensics, you're able to go, it's much faster, it's quicker, and it decreases your time from detecting an issue to remediating the issue in its entirety.
Hey, Robert, we have a question here. Adam is wondering how often should one run snapshot.ps1 and is curious because wouldn't the results change every month due to Microsoft updates?
That was one of the problems when you go and you're doing this manually, which is a really good question. You're absolutely correct. Any time you run snapshot PS1, it will give you the updates and information based on that point in time. So if you're doing non-automated tools, you just have to keep in mind that when you do updates, you're going to have to re-go through your snapshotting process. Unfortunately, that's one of the hazards of this. But when you're doing something manual as opposed to a commercial automated tool. But good question. Anything else?
Doesn't look like it at this time.
Okay, so creating an IR toolkit. This would be an example of a toolkit that you could quickly put together for PowerShell and command prompts in order that you have a trusted prompt when you're actually going and interfacing with a system. Because one of the things you want to keep in mind is you don't want to do any harm. As an incident responder, you need to determine what the problem is, but until you have that root cause pinned down, you still have to, in your back of your mind, be wondering, am I going to have to, is management or is the team lead, IR team lead, going to decide that we need to bring a forensic analyst? So until that decision is made, you want to limit your interaction as much as possible with the artifacts or take care not to modify any of the artifacts within the Windows operating system. So what we have here is this screenshot is trying to show you where we are creating an IR toolkit by getting, in this case, a USB drive, and we copied over onto a clean formatted USB drive the Windows PowerShell folders and files onto that USB drive. You also can put on there the command prompt files, or you can use systools, Microsoft systools, on here, so that way you're running everything off of that particular thumb drive, and you're not using the native instance of those tools residing on the operating system. Here where it says Windows PowerShell, and it actually provides you with the PowerShell prompt, you can see that here I'm running off of E as opposed to C because the thumb drive is at an E. Here, when you go and you insert the toolkit, you can put it on USB, CD, or ISO, and you would open the trusted instance of PowerShell. And as here under Process Explorer, I have here that you can see the PowerShell.exe prompt was actually brought up as underneath Explorer as opposed from the Windows operating system itself. Also, on step 2, I have here to start PowerShell transcription. What this does is anything that you type into the PowerShell prompt is immediately gone and put into a transcript. That way you're able to capture everything that you do in this transcript so that if your team decides that we need to bring and perform a forensic investigation after the fact, you can go and you can present to the investigator, this is what I did up to the point where we took the image. So that way it helps them so that they can say and build a case that, no, your IT department did not go and modify any of the artifacts, and it's more of a legal protection for you. What we're doing here, the next step before you'd actually start the investigation, when you see this incident has occurred, you show up, you start the transcription service. The next thing, what I suggested here, is you want to go and get the serial number for that particular USB drive. That way, it's on record in the transcript that the IR Toolkit USB thumb drive was plugged into the system, and this is its serial number. This is actually located in the USB store inside the registry. Now, in Windows 7 and 8, the registry location is in the PS child name, for the USB devices, it's a unique serial number. Devices without a unique serial number will have an ampersand in the second character of the PS child name. What I did here to prove that when you go and you enter the commandlet where I have run get item property and I point to the path, in the PowerShell, you can see under the black screen capture, I have the individual PowerShell the serial number for that particular USB device in PowerShell, but then I also went and opened up the registry using regedit and actually showed you here in the highlighted part that that is in fact the serial number for that particular USB device. So now that we've captured the thumb drive serial number, next we go and we want to capture the volume GUID that the system would assign to this toolkit, as well as the drive letter. And you can get that also through the registry, through the mounted devices key. Lastly, if you run the PS version table in PowerShell, it will give you the version of PowerShell that is being used. I'd include this here just so that it is specific to anyone after the fact that you have gone and you've gone and established PowerShell, you know its version, and if there's any questions after the fact. So now you're able to go, and if you would open up your transcript, which the screenshot here is trying to show the entries that in the trusted instance of PowerShell, everything that was included in that instance of PowerShell was written to our transcript file, which is what I have open here in Notepad to the right on the slide. From here, you're able to get the USB serial number, the GUID of volume GUID assigned to the USB, the version of PowerShell. You also get the date and time, and the user account which executed these commandlets in PowerShell. And at this point, you now have all the necessary information in the transcript so that if a question would come up after the fact, such as, well, how do I know that you didn't modify something that opposing counsel would ask, how do I know that you didn't modify something or introduce something to the system which actually caused the problem? You would be able to produce the transcript and defend yourself. Now, if an organization has disabled USB devices or CD or DVD drive access, then you'd obviously have to use the machine's native instance of PowerShell to collect any artifacts from the Windows operating system. And as again, always, the goal of incident response is not to do digital forensics. The goal of incident response is to identify a problem, determine if the issue is security related or not, determine if you want to go and potentially pursue a future investigation. If you do, take an image of the system as well as the memory, and then proceed the rest of your steps outlined in one of the first slides in incident response, where you isolate, remediate, and reintroduce back to the network. This slide gives you a couple of examples of artifacts that can be collected from a Microsoft system. I have here just 30. Again, as I had mentioned before, if you have any questions or would like to read some additional information about this or any of the other slides, each slide I have included the reference link to various white papers on the topic for this that I use for this presentation. One thing, item number 27 is typed URLs. I wanted to draw that attention to people because sometimes some people in incident response will go and they'll look at the typed URLs key in the registry and say, okay, the user went and typed in foxnews.com or CNN.com or some website that they really shouldn't have gone to, whether it be pornographic in nature or a PTP site or something of that. And clearly they're the ones, they did it because the user did it. We know it because it's some typed URLs. The reason I draw and mention this specifically is in 2004 timeframe, there was a case where a teacher was actually fired, and then a substitute teacher was actually fired from a school district and brought up on charges for showing pornography to students in her classroom. And the forensic examiner who had done the investigation said that she, in fact, did look at these pornographic websites in her classroom because those entries were included in the typed URLs. Well, something to keep in mind is with in the typed URLs registry key, it's used for the autocomplete feature in Internet Explorer. So, for example, if you are typing something, Microsoft will try and be helpful and complete what they think you're going to type. And in this case, in the case that I actually am referencing, a piece of malware was actually found on this teacher's computer. That malware was directing her to a website that was pornographic in nature, and then that malware, once it got there, through the autocomplete feature, was sending her on a rabbit hole of various illicit websites. But all that information was showing up in the typed URLs. I say this because when you're pursuing a forensic investigation, you can't hang your hat just on one artifact. You have to check, double check, and triple check, and corroborate between multiple artifacts to build your case. And when you're doing a forensic investigation, you're also using additional tools that you might not have available to you if you're just doing incident response. So scenarios. These scenarios that I'm going to go through here, they're actually referenced in a white paper by Sands again. And if you have any questions or you'd like to read more about it, I direct you to those particular white papers, and I included them again in each slide. So for this scenario, it's a data leakage investigation. The IT department suspects that an employee is taking sensitive data out of the organization via USB, but they can't prove it. A search of the Exchange and a web proxy indicates the user is not sending out of the organization via third-party webmail. So you have a couple of goals, obviously, as your IT department. You want to determine first, is that file that we think they're taking out of the organization, is it actually on their computer? Second, you want to identify what USB devices were actually plugged into this computer. Third, you want to identify when the USB devices were first plugged into the computer. You'd want to identify when the USB devices were last plugged into the system, trying to establish a time frame here. You want to identify the drive letters that were assigned to those USB devices once it was mounted. And then you want to determine if corporate information was placed onto that USB. And if you determine in step 6 that it was placed onto USB, you'd want to contact a digital forensic analyst to actually perform a forensically sound examination for a potential legal action. And again, as a caveat, I say as an incident responder, you'd want to ensure that you'd have PowerShell transcription turned on so that all of your steps are captured so you can turn it over to the forensic analyst. So first, what are we going to do here? We'd go and we'd use PowerShell, and we'd actually go and search the computer to see if the file is actually on their computer. This can be done remotely, or it can be done locally. Now, in this case, because we're not dealing with an outbreak of malware, or we're not dealing with a spreading security incident, we're just dealing with a potential data leakage, we're not using the IR Toolkit that we spent the time to create in the last few slides. Here we're actually going, and we'd be doing this remotely, and you'd be opening up a remote instance of PowerShell to that particular system. GCI stands for Get Child Path. So you're basically saying, get the child items, the path is the C drive, you're going to do recurse, which means you're going to continue to go and check each item. You're going to do force, saying continue to check each item until it's done, and every item is checked by ignoring the file attributes. The error action is silently continue, which means if for some reason an error is invoked, don't show it on my screen as a big red text. In fact, just continue to go to the next item. And then lastly, include. The include parameter is where we go and we actually specify the text that we think that the title, the document is. So in this case, it's called virtual containment. So when we run this, it comes back and says, yes, in C documents and settings, so on and so forth, there is a document and it's called virtual containment.docx. All right, so we now know that that particular file is in fact on that user C drive. Now we want to identify the USB devices that have been plugged into the system. Now you'll notice that the PowerShell script that we're running here is actually the same script that we did when we were setting up transcription. I'm sorry, when we were setting up just before we set up transcription with the IR Toolkit. We go and we enter that and we get a list, as we can see in the screenshot, of all the USB devices that have been plugged into the computer. The next step is we want to identify the USB devices that were when it was first connected. By doing this, we're interrogating the USB store, then we're piping that information into a select statement where we're selecting the name, and then we're saying now for each object found, go and perform the following actions where we're actually pulling up the Windows event logs. And then we're piping that output, again, to the time it was created, the message, and then we're sorting it. By doing that, we're able to get a list for every USB device of when it was first connected, which leads us directly into we need to know when it was last connected. And you're going to see here that this is basically the same thing. We're just modifying the parameters somewhat so that instead of first connection time, we're looking for last connection time. So let's recap. We know that the file in question, the document in question, is on the user C drive. We now have a list of every USB device that was plugged into the user's computer, and we have when that device was first plugged in and when that device was last plugged in. Okay. Now the next thing is we want to know the drive letter that the system assigned to that USB device. Again, we're going back to the USB store, and by doing that, we're able to go and generate a list of the volume drives. The next step, we want to find the user account that actually accessed that USB drive. So first you'd find out the GUIDs of the mounted devices, and then second, you'd actually have to search the mount points within the registry for that USB GUID. So here we're looking at a different registry location. It's called mounted devices. And we're getting the GUID for those particular mounted devices. Next, we'd actually want to search the user account's mount points for the USB GUID of the USB device. So we're building a path. First, we went and established that the document was on the C drive. Next, we went and we found the USB devices. Then we went and found the volumes, the volume GUIDs. Then we found the drive letters. Now we're trying to find the GUIDs. Now we're trying to go and establish that those GUIDs were in fact placed into the mount points for the user profile. And now the next part, we want to look for link files. Anytime you go and you open up a document or something in Microsoft, it'll create a .lnk file. This is a link file. It's a system file that will go and think of it as a shortcut, and it goes back to the original target. Now, in this case, when we go and we look at the link files, what we see here is that originally for virtual containment.docx, there was a link file, and that link file, which is on the C drive, is actually now pointing to the E drive, which was where the USB had been connected to. The volume, the the volume drive that had been assigned by the system to the USB had a target of E, and we can see here that the person had gone, and the link is now giving us indication that, yes, the person went and copied from the C drive to a USB thumb drive with a volume drive of E to the virtual containment.docx. The second scenario that I was going to talk to you about isn't as involved. This one, you're the IT department and you notice that the firewall logs that have several hosts that are communicating with a suspicious IP that is registered an errand to a company in a province in China. You find that odd because you have no dealings with anyone in China. The IT department needs to know why the host is communicating with this remote system. So here you only have really one goal. Your goal is use a PowerShell script to determine what the remote system is communicating with on the local corporate host. This will be the output of the script. Basically what the script is doing, and I'm going to go through it with you in the next slide. The script goes and it interrogates the local system, and you know which local system to go to based on the firewall logs, or your network analytics platform. You go to that host with that local IP and run the PowerShell script. When you do, you can come back and you will give you the local IP and the port being used, the remote IP and the port being used, the process ID, the process name, the process start time, file path, and associated DLLs with that path. And it places all that information first into an array in PowerShell, and then places from that array, it converts it into a HTML table that is actually shown here as a HTML file. Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's great. Well, what is that going to do for us? In this example here, this is actually a perfectly legitimate process. It's Microsoft Link. But what if instead of it still said link.exe is the process file path, but instead of the known directory where it's supposed to reside, which is C program files, Microsoft Office 15, so on and so forth, what if it went to a temp directory? And you see that. So when you go and you open up Task Manager or your whatever process monitor that you're using on that host, and you see link.exe is running, and you think, okay, that's not a problem. But when you go and you, after further analysis, you go and you realize, well, wait a minute, that link.exe isn't running out of the directory that it's normally associated with, but in fact out of a temp directory, or some other folder buried deep in the C drive that is not a Microsoft common directory. That immediately gives you some ideas that you need to go and look and see what else is wrong. It also could be just an indicator of compromise. This is the script that I mentioned that produced the output from the previous slide, where it says IP at the top, x.x.x.x. You would simply substitute x.x.x.x for the IP in question. And that in turn, as we had mentioned before, the first part of the slide, the first part of the script, you're setting up the HTML, and the goal is to, in that portion, it creates a variable called out file. You then go and it creates a bottom portion of the PowerShell script. It then goes and interrogates the local system. It takes all that information from the interrogation, places it into an array, and that array is then converted into an HTML table and displayed. So what are your 2-minute takeaways from this? PowerShell is a really powerful tool. It can be used during incident response as well as for everyday administration. 90% of incident response occurs before the incident happens, and preparation is absolutely the key. Organizations need to write a well-defined incident response plan. Organizations need to create a well-defined incident response team with roles, responsibilities, chain of command, and 100% buy-in from management. If management in your organization does not accept the idea or the premise that you need an incident response team, you'll be fighting very much an uphill battle. And then practice and become familiar with the tools that are available to you. The point of this presentation was I completely understand and have empathy for those folks whose budget doesn't allow them or afford them to be able to purchase a lot of the automated tools. But by using PowerShell, which is already in your environment, you can accomplish a lot of the incident response tasks. However, it's just more manual and tactile in nature. Lastly, the final takeaway. Evaluate your organization's incident response plan. Do you even have one? We already talked about the necessity for the IR team and the roles that are established. Complete tabletop exercises before an incident occurs, where you actually walk through various scenarios with the members of your IR team. Basically, it's a lot of what ifs. What if this happens? And you walk through it. If you're already doing that, then take the next step and schedule a penetration test. In this case, you can go and on an annual basis, a lot of organizations already are having a vulnerability scan, whether it be internal or external, where the vulnerability scan goes and identifies vulnerabilities, but it doesn't act on them. It's just simply an identifier. A penetration test is where an active agent, whether it be a consultant or unfortunately it wouldn't be a penetration test, but a hacker would take identified vulnerabilities and attack your organization. But you'd want to have a white hat team actually do that for you in a controlled environment and as a penetration test. If you're already doing a penetration test, then leverage that and do an advanced penetration test where it's more of a red team, blue team concept, where the red team, which would be the pen testers, are actively trying to exploit any identified vulnerabilities. And then your blue team, which is your IR department and your IT department, they go and they're actively trying to go and locate and identify the attacks from the pen testers. They're then able to, this is a controlled environment, and you're able to go and walk through your incident response scenarios. This would be invaluable because by doing this, you're getting real-world experience, and you can also then, if any point it becomes too intense, you can call a timeout and talk to your IR consultant, or excuse me, your pen tester consultant who is doing the work for you to walk you through what is going on so that you're able to go and gain knowledge, and there's a knowledge transfer there that will increase your team's performance. And lastly, I have in here, keep calm and learn PowerShell. As Microsoft continues to leverage this scripting capabilities with PowerShell, it'll only become more and more powerful and more of a necessity. And that concludes this presentation, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to field them at this point. If there are no questions, then I'll turn it back over to Anna.
Great. So on behalf of myself and all of our panelists today, we thank you for joining us and taking time to view our presentation. If you have any further questions or would like to learn more or talk to one of our security consultants, please reach out to marketing.team@CoreBTS and we'll get you connected. You should see a link to this recording in your inbox within the next 24 to 48 hours. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.